The desert wind moves like memory, hot, slow, and endless. In the silence between its gusts, a lone archaeologist brushes sand from a small, curved fragment of clay. The marks on it are faint but deliberate, arranged in neat columns. What he's holding is older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, a surviving line from the Sumerian king list. It begins with an impossible statement. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it goes further, naming kings who ruled not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. And after them, it says, came a great flood that wiped the world clean. A single line dividing myth from history, or maybe something else, something the modern world has chosen to forget. Before we begin this journey, take a moment. Subscribe if you'd like to follow these lost civilizations, and tell me where you're listening from. Every story, like every ancient city, begins with a single name recorded somewhere. Let yours be one of them. The tablet's message is as unsettling as it is elegant. It tells of 8 kings who reigned before a flood so vast, so final, that time itself had to begin again afterward. Archaeologists call it myth, yet the Sumerians wrote it as history, cold, structured, matter-of-fact. No poetry, no symbolism, just a list of names, numbers, and cities swallowed by water. They called their homeland Ki-en-Gir, the land of the lords of civilization. We call it Sumer, the cradle of the modern world. But buried in its clay is a suggestion that our story might not have started from scratch, but from ruins left behind by something far older. The oldest surviving copy of the king list was found at Lhasa, inscribed sometime around 2000 BCE, though the story itself was already ancient by then. Dozens of versions exist, each slightly different, yet all share the same structure. First the divine kings, then the flood, then the mortal dynasties that followed. It's as if someone wanted to preserve continuity across a cosmic disaster, to prove that kingship, the very idea of civilization, was never destroyed, only interrupted. The list became their proof that humanity's right to rule survived, even when the world drowned. The first city on the list is Eridu, on the southern edge of Mesopotamia, near what is now Tel Abu Sharain in Iraq. Archaeologists have traced its layers deep into prehistory. Temples built one atop another, stretching back nearly 8,000 years. In its oldest level, they found fish bones, shells, and traces of freshwater reeds, signs that the city once stood on the shore of a vast inland sea. Local myths said this was where the god Enki brought wisdom to humankind. The king list simply states that Alulim became king in Eridu. He ruled for 28,800 years. For the Sumerians, that wasn't exaggeration. It was the divine measure of time itself. Each of those antediluvian kings reigned for ages so long that they seem impossible. Al-Algar ruled 36,000 years, and Menluana 40 the way through 200 years. Scholars say these numbers are symbolic, a code for lunar cycles or sacred mathematics. But what if they were something else? Echoes of memory distorted by flood and time? Across the world, other cultures told similar stories. Atlantis swallowed by the sea, the flood of Noah, the destruction of Dwarka in India, the sinking of the land of Lemuria. Everywhere the same pattern, a golden age of knowledge, a cataclysm, then the slow rebuilding of civilization from mud and memory. To the Sumerians, this flood wasn't punishment, it was a reset. The gods, they said, decided that humanity had grown too loud, too ambitious, too close to the heavens. The waters came not as vengeance, but as cleansing. When the flood ended, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time in the city of Kish. In that single phrase lies a profound truth. Civilization to them was divine technology, something bestowed, not invented. The idea of self-rule didn't evolve gradually. It arrived intact, like a gift remembered from before the waters. Imagine standing on the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates at dawn. The land is flat as an ocean bed, the soil rich and black. Somewhere beneath your feet lie the remains of cities built before recorded time, foundations warped by pressure, bricks fused by ancient floods. When archaeologists dug through the strata at Shurupak and Ur, they found exactly that, a thick layer of river silt sandwiched between two levels of human habitation. Above it, normal life resumes, pottery, tools, writing. Below it, silence, a clean break, like the pause between heartbeats. Carbon dating places that flood layer around 2900 BCE, startlingly close to the date the king list implies. The people who emerged after that flood were not the same as those before. They built differently, thought differently. The temples of Eridu were low and rounded, built of reeds and clay. The cities that rose after the flood, Kish, Uruk, Ur, were angular, monumental, geometric. It's as if a new kind of intelligence had entered the world, one obsessed with precision, order, and permanence. The gods no longer walked among men, but their shadow remained in every brick. And this is where the king list stops being myth and starts to look like memory. The Sumerians weren't telling a fable. They were documenting succession. They saw history as inheritance. Even when the flood erased the world, the idea of kingship remained untouched, waiting to descend again. That's what made their civilization so resilient. They didn't see destruction as the end, but as renewal. But what exactly was erased? The king list is frustratingly silent about the world before the flood. It names the cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, but gives no details of their culture, no laws, no wars, no art. It's as if the scribes themselves couldn't comprehend what had been lost. All that survived were numbers, impossibly large reigns that might be mathematical memorials to vanished dynasties. Some researchers even suspect those numbers encode celestial data, precession cycles, planetary orbits, the rhythms of time itself. If that's true, then the forgotten empire erased by the flood might not be a place at all, but an era when human knowledge was far older and deeper than we realize. As the centuries passed, the memory of that world blurred. The flood became a story, the divine kings turned into gods, and the king list into sacred record. Yet its influence never faded. When the Hebrews wrote of Noah, when the Greeks spoke of Deucalion, when the Hindus told of Manu, they were echoing the same ancient memory, a flood that ended an age. The idea spread because the trauma was real. Somewhere in humanity's collective past, something immense drowned the world we once knew. Still, for all its mysteries, the king list ends with hope. After the flood, humanity rebuilds. Kings rise again, this time mortal, but guided by divine order. Civilization restarts, measured, cautious, aware of fragility. The gods have withdrawn, but their lesson remains. That power is not creation, but stewardship. And that's where our story begins, at the edge of the flood, with the survivors who built a new world atop the bones of the old one. In the next part, we'll step deeper into that silence, following the first post-flood kings, the rise of Kish, and the strange emergence of writing, the tool that would make humanity eternal. When the waters finally retreated, the land that emerged was raw and scarred, a canvas of mud and silence stretching as far as the eye could see. The flood had scoured everything clean, stripping the world of colour and memory alike. What had once been a network of shining cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, was now nothing but silt and ruin. The survivors must have wandered through this emptiness in disbelief, searching for familiar landmarks only to find they had all been erased. For them, time had stopped, civilization had ended, and yet somehow the story did not end there. The Sumerian king list records what came next in a single cryptic line. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven once more. Kingship was in Kish. That phrase, quiet, almost casual, marks one of the greatest turning points in human history. It is the moment civilization was reborn. The world began again, but it began differently this time. The divine had receded. The gods no longer ruled openly. Humanity would have to rebuild the world on its own, brick by brick, word by word. The city of Kish rose from the mud like a scar made sacred. Its ruins still stand near modern Tel al-Uhaymir in Iraq, a mound of layered clay where history folds upon itself. Beneath its foundations, archaeologists found the same story told by the tablets, a thick band of sterile silt, the fingerprint of a massive flood lying between two civilizations. Below it, traces of an older world. Above it, a new one built in its shadow. The people who built Kish weren't just survivors. They were recreators, carrying fragments of a memory they could no longer fully recall. They remembered enough to rebuild, but not enough to understand what they had lost. Jusha was the first king of this new world. The king list credits him with a reign of 100 to 200 years, though what that number truly means is lost to time. Perhaps it was symbolic, a measure of rebirth, a statement of endurance. What mattered was that kingship, the link between heaven and earth, had been restored. Jusha ruled not as a god, but as a man charged with divine duty. To the people of Kish, he wasn't a conqueror or tyrant. He was a bridge between the world that drowned and the world reborn. The flood had destroyed everything but the idea of order, and from that idea came purpose. The new kings of Kish built temples, not to flaunt wealth, but to restore connection. They offered sacrifices to the gods, not out of devotion, but out of fear that forgetting would bring the waters again. Every prayer was a treaty, every brick a contract. The Sumerians believed that if they could rebuild the structure of the world, the me, as they called it, they could anchor the universe back into balance. Kish itself became the model for all later cities. Its streets were laid in careful grids, its canals engineered to control the rivers that had once destroyed them. The walls were thick, the temples massive, their designs geometric and deliberate. Everything about Kish spoke of discipline. Civilization, reborn from chaos, now existed to resist chaos. It was humanity's first act of collective engineering, not just of stone and clay, but of belief. The flood had changed the human soul. Before, the Sumerians had seen themselves as part of the gods' household, children of divine parents who guided them, punished them, and walked among them. After the flood, that intimacy was gone. The gods were distant, abstract, sometimes silent. In their absence, humanity developed something entirely new, responsibility. The world was now theirs to maintain, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. The flood wasn't just a memory. It was a warning that hung over every generation. And so, out of fear, came innovation. In the clay archives of Kish, archaeologists have found the earliest examples of organized writing. The tablets are simple, lists of rations, inventories of livestock, grain tallies. But behind their simplicity lies a profound truth. Writing was born not from poetry or art, but from the need to impose order on chaos. The flood had taught the Sumerians that memory could drown. Clay would become their lifeline. Every mark pressed into wet earth was a promise. We will not forget again. The king list itself was part of this same impulse. To record was to survive. The Sumerians understood that death meant nothing if the name endured. They called this Z, the breath of life, something that could be given to words as easily as to flesh. To write a king's name was to grant him immortality. To erase it was to drown him in oblivion. In this way, history itself became sacred, and scribes became its priests. The people of Kish also became engineers of time. They divided the heavens, mapped the seasons, charted the paths of the stars. To them, astronomy wasn't science, it was communication. Each celestial pattern was a divine message, a reminder of cosmic balance. The stars were the gods' handwriting, mirrored in the wedge-shaped lines of cuneiform. When they looked upward, they didn't see mystery. They saw instruction. But for all their devotion to order, the Sumerians never escaped the shadow of fear. The rivers that gave them life were also their constant threat. Every year, when the Tigris and Euphrates began to rise, they reenacted the old rituals, purifications, sacrifices, offerings. The priests would climb to the top of the ziggurat and scatter grain to the winds, reciting the old flood incantations. May the waters rise but not devour. May the gods remember their covenant. In their prayers echoed the trauma of the world that had drowned. Life in Kish was a balance between gratitude and dread. By day, the markets bustled, merchants shouting, donkeys braying, copper gleaming in the sun. By night, the city fell into ritual silence. The streets emptied. The temple lamps glowed like small suns across the darkened plain. Inside, the priests sang hymns to Nana, the moon god, and measured time by his silver face. The flood had taught them that day brings creation, but night holds judgment. And in that world of light and shadow lived Etana, the first human king to dream beyond the earth. The king list calls him the shepherd who ascended to heaven. His legend is the first recorded human myth of flight, a man born aloft by an eagle climbing through the clouds in search of the plant of birth, a symbol of life renewed. Etana's ascent is more than a story. It's a metaphor for civilization itself. Humanity, grounded by catastrophe, was learning to reach again for the heavens. In some versions of the tale, Etana succeeds. He returns with the plant, restoring life and fertility to the land. In others he falls, his wings of faith burning away as he nears the divine. Either ending speaks the same truth. The flood might have broken humanity's body, but not its spirit. The Sumerians would never stop reaching upward, even if it meant falling again and again. Under Etana's reign, the line between myth and history began to blur. For the first time, kingship wasn't divine blood. It was divine behavior. To rule was to act in harmony with the heavens, to uphold balance, to keep the flood at bay. The king became a symbol of cosmic alignment. His justice mirrored the movement of the stars. His failures echoed in the weather and harvest. The king was no longer a god, but if he ruled wisely, he could keep the gods near. In the centuries that followed, Kish's influence spread across the plains. Other cities rose, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, each claiming kingship for itself. With growth came pride, and with pride came rivalry. The harmony that the flood had forced upon humanity began to fracture. Each city built higher walls, each ruler sought greater glory, and in their ambition the old fear faded. Humanity was forgetting again. Still, the scribes kept writing. Each king was added to the list, each reign measured and memorialized. The tablets grew heavier, the archives larger. What began as a humble record became a monument in itself, a living chronicle of divine descent and human persistence. When one city fell, another copied its lineage, preserving the chain unbroken. It was as though the Sumerians understood that even if their cities crumbled, the story must continue. For them, oblivion was not death, it was erasure. And so they built not for the gods, but for memory. The temples were their archives, the ziggurats were their libraries, and the clay, eternal and unburning, became their medium of immortality. Even the flood, in all its destruction, could not dissolve clay. That was their genius. They built their history out of the very earth that had once consumed them. 5,000 years later, when archaeologists unearthed the tablets of Kish, they found more than writing. They found the echo of resilience. Every line was an act of resistance, a whisper from a civilization that refused to vanish. And in that whisper, we can still hear their fear. What if it happens again? The flood was gone, but its memory never died. It lived in their prayers, their architecture, their stories. It became the heartbeat of civilization itself, a reminder that all order is temporary, all progress fragile, all memory mortal. But as long as someone wrote, someone remembered, the flood could never truly win. From Kish's dusty plains to the gleaming walls of Uruk, that belief became the foundation of the ancient world. Humanity had risen from the mud and learned to build against oblivion. But soon one city would rise higher than all others, a city that would try to outbuild death itself, a city of kings and poets, walls and dreams. Its name was Uruk, and its ruler would be the first man to challenge heaven directly, a king named Gilgamesh. The story of Kish is one of rebirth, of civilization learning to breathe again after drowning. But Uruk is something else entirely. It is the moment humanity remembers its strength and dares to challenge the silence of the gods. It is the first city that didn't just rebuild the past, but tried to surpass it. Kish restored the order of heaven. Uruk sought to rewrite it. And at the center of that ambition stood a single man, part divine, part human, a ruler whose name has outlived even the gods who made him, Gilgamesh. The Sumerian king list marks Uruk as the next seat of kingship after Kish. In Uruk, Gilgamesh became king. He ruled for 126 years. It's a number that feels mythical, yet beneath the exaggeration lies a real truth. Gilgamesh was the first historical figure to become immortal, not through blood or conquest, but through story. When he ascended the throne around 2700 BCE, the flood was already centuries past, but its shadow still shaped the human heart. The people of Uruk had inherited both the trauma and the wisdom of those who rebuilt the world. Yet in their hands, faith began to evolve into something more daring, curiosity. If Kish was a city of recovery, Uruk was a city of defiance. Rising from the Mesopotamian plain like a man-made mountain range, its walls stretched for miles, wide enough for chariots to ride abreast, high enough to rival the ziggurats themselves. To the Sumerians, walls were more than protection, they were declaration. A city without walls was a village, a city with them was eternal. Gilgamesh didn't just build walls to keep enemies out, he built them to keep oblivion out. Each brick, stamped with his name, was an act of defiance against time itself. The legend says that when Gilgamesh looked upon his city, he spoke with pride. Go up on the wall of Uruk and walk around. Examine the foundation terrace and inspect the brickwork. Is not its masonry of burnt brick? Did not the 7 sages lay its foundations? In that moment, the voice of humanity changes. Gone is the fear of floods and gods. In its place rises confidence, the belief that man can create as the gods once did. But pride, even when noble, carries danger. The people of Uruk loved their king, yet feared his hunger. The flood had taught humanity humility, but Gilgamesh was born to test its limits. Half divine through his mother, the goddess Ninsun, and half mortal through his father Lugalbanda, he embodied both worlds. He ruled with brilliance and arrogance, demanding that his name be remembered forever. The gods, watching from afar, saw in him both a reflection of their own creation and a warning that humanity was learning to rival them. It was to humble him that they created Enkidu, a man of the wild, a creature of clay and breath, shaped to balance Gilgamesh's fire. The meeting of the two is one of the oldest recorded friendships in history, and perhaps its first moral parable. When Gilgamesh sent his soldiers to subdue Enkidu, the wild man fought him instead, matching the king's strength blow for blow. They battled for hours, shaking the very walls of Uruk. When at last Gilgamesh prevailed, neither claimed victory. They looked at one another, saw themselves mirrored and embraced. Two halves of humanity, the civilized and the untamed, united at last. Together, they set out on a journey that would change the world. Their first quest was to slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. Scholars see this as myth, but it also reads like memory, a reflection of humanity's first great exploration beyond the Fertile Crescent. The forest they describe may have been Lebanon, rich with cedars used to build temples and ships. In killing Humbaba, Gilgamesh symbolically claimed dominion over nature itself. It was the next step in civilization's evolution, not just to survive the world, but to master it. When they returned to Uruk, crowned in glory, even the goddess Ishtar herself desired Gilgamesh, but he refused her, calling her love a curse. In his defiance, the gods saw what they had always feared, that humanity might one day reject them entirely. Ishtar unleashed the bull of heaven to punish him, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed it too. The victory was brilliant, the consequence was fatal. The gods decreed that one of the two friends must die. Enkidu fell ill, wasting away in agony. His death shattered Gilgamesh. The man who had built walls to outlast time found himself face to face with mortality. His arrogance turned to terror. His defiance became grief. And so he left Uruk behind and began a new journey, not to conquer, but to understand. The flood that had shaped his ancestors became the center of his search. Gilgamesh sought out Utnapishtim, the one man who had survived the great flood and been granted eternal life. His journey took him through deserts, mountains, and the waters of death. Echoes of the Sumerian world's geography and mythic memory combined. When he finally found Utnapishtim, the survivor told him the true story, how the gods had once destroyed humanity, how one man had been warned to build a boat, how the flood had cleansed the earth. In that moment, history folded back upon itself. Gilgamesh, the king of walls, the defier of gods, found himself standing in the shadow of the flood that had once erased the world, the same cycle repeating. And Utnapishtim's words cut to the core. Immortality is not for man. The gods gave us death so that life would matter. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, broken yet transformed. He stood once more upon the walls he had built, and finally saw them for what they were, not a monument to himself, but a symbol of continuity. His immortality would not be of flesh, but of memory. And so he left behind his story, the epic of Gilgamesh, carved into tablets, written in the same clay that had preserved the names of his ancestors. In doing so, he achieved the very eternity he had sought. Through Gilgamesh, humanity learned that immortality lies not in defying the gods, but in remembering. His epic is the oldest surviving story in human history, and it ends where it began, with the walls of Uruk still standing, still echoing with the footsteps of the living. The king lists him simply. Gilgamesh, whose father was a ghost, ruled for 126 years. But behind those words is the birth of philosophy. The Sumerians had turned tragedy into wisdom. The flood had cleansed the world, but Uruk taught humanity to understand it. From this point forward, history no longer belonged to gods. It belonged to men who remembered. And yet, as Uruk flourished, the seeds of another flood, not of water, but of ambition, began to grow. Civilization had become confident, restless, hungry. The Sumerians had conquered nature. Now they would turn upon each other. The world would see the rise of empires, of armies, of law, and of divine authority reborn in new forms. In the next part, we will follow that transformation, from the sacred cities of Sumer to the mighty empire of Akkad, where kings no longer received power from heaven, but claimed it for themselves. For the first time, humanity would not just inherit the divine order, it would attempt to control it. The flood had made us survivors, Uruk made us dreamers, but Akkad would make us gods again. The flood had washed the world clean. The cities of Sumer had risen again from the clay, cautious and reverent, rebuilding brick by brick under the watchful silence of the gods. But by the time centuries had passed, That silence no longer inspired awe, it inspired ambition. Humanity had grown confident. The kings of Kish, Ur, and Uruk had turned mud into stone, myth into memory. They had learned to tame rivers, to read the heavens, to summon the names of gods through writing. The divine order, once a celestial gift, now felt like something that could be shaped by human hands. And so, from that confidence came a new kind of ruler, not one chosen by the gods, but one who chose himself. His name was Sargon of Akkad, and through him the age of divine kings ended. The age of human empire began. Sargon's beginnings were not noble. Born to an unknown mother, a temple priestess, he was set adrift as a newborn, sealed in a basket and carried by the currents of the Euphrates. The parallels to later myths are striking. Moses, Romulus, even the infant Karna from the Mahabharata, all born in secrecy, all destined to rise. But Sargon's story was the first. The waters that had once drowned humanity now bore its first emperor. He was found by a gardener, raised among laborers, learning the language of soil and sweat before the language of kings. But the boy carried within him the memory of something greater, perhaps the echo of that ancient flood, that old divine rebellion that lingered in every human dream. When he grew to manhood, he became the cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of Kish, the very city that had once been the cradle of rebirth after the deluge. Yet ambition simmered beneath his service. The gods no longer chose kings, now men would take the throne by their own hand, and Sargon took it with fire. The story of his rise is fragmented, told in clay and shadow. Some say he overthrew his master, others that he was chosen in secret by the goddess Ishtar herself. But however it happened, Sargon united the warring city-states under one banner. The flood had cleansed the world. Sargon now forged it anew. From Kish, Ur, Uruk, and Lagash he carved an empire, and when he built his capital, Akkad, he placed it not in the ancient south, where the old gods had ruled, but in the north, in land unclaimed by divine tradition. It was a symbolic rebellion. The throne of heaven had moved. Akkad has never been found. Its location is lost to time, buried somewhere beneath centuries of dust. But its shadow remains everywhere. The Akkadians became the first true imperial power, a kingdom of many languages, many gods, many peoples. For the first time in history, humanity was united not by flood or divine will, but by law, military, and trade. The rivers that had once divided cities now bound them together like veins. Sargon called himself King of the Four Quarters of the World. It was the boldest claim ever made by a human. Not even Gilgamesh had dared to declare such dominion. In that title was something radical, the idea that man could encompass creation itself. The gods had once ruled the world from heaven. Now Sargon ruled it from the earth, and the world bent to his will. Under his reign, soldiers marched as far west as the Mediterranean and as far east as Elam. His empire stretched from sea to sea, a scope no one had imagined possible. He imposed a single language, Akkadian, blending Sumerian words with his own. It became the first lingua franca of civilization, the ancestor of Babylonian and Assyrian alike. In its cuneiform lines we can still trace his legacy, neat, deliberate, unstoppable. The Sumerians had written to remember. The Akkadians wrote to command. Every city under Sargon's rule sent tribute to Akkad: gold, grain, lapis lazuli, incense. From the temples of Ur came sacred oils, from the mountains copper and tin. His bureaucrats recorded every measure, every offering. For the first time, writing became a weapon of empire. Clay tablets replaced swords in some battles, contracts replaced kings. The gods were still worshipped, but they now served politics. Temples became extensions of the state. Priests bowed to governors. The Anunnaki, once seen as architects of the cosmos, were now invoked to justify conquest. When Sargon built a temple to Ishtar, he did so not as a supplicant, but as an equal. He claimed her as his patron, a goddess of war and love, and in doing so he merged the divine and the mortal in himself. In his lifetime, Sargon was unstoppable, but empires built by force carry the seeds of collapse in their foundation. After decades of expansion, the rivers began to change. The rains faltered, the fields cracked. What had once been fertile turned white with salt. Akkad's own success had exhausted the land. Overfarming and irrigation had poisoned the soil. The flood that once brought life now brought ruin. Only this time, it came not from water but from the absence of it. The Sumerian lamentations tell of dust storms blotting out the sun, of rivers running dry, of people wandering in hunger. The storm of the gods, the texts call it, not rain but wind and drought. The empire began to crumble under its own weight. Sargon's successors struggled to hold it together. His grandson, Naram-Sin, inherited both the glory and the curse. At first, he expanded the empire further than ever, conquering the Zagros mountains, subduing Elam, building temples that pierced the horizon. But with power came arrogance. Where Sargon had declared himself the king of the world, Naram-Sin declared himself a god. On his great stele, still standing today in the Louvre, Naram-Sin towers above his soldiers, carved larger than life. He wears the horned crown of divinity, the symbol of the gods themselves. His spear pierces the bodies of his enemies, while the stars of heaven shine above him. He does not pray. He does not kneel. He ascends. It is the perfect image of human ambition and its inevitable doom. The priests of Nippur, guardians of Enlil's temple, saw his self-deification as blasphemy. They withdrew their support, and the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia turned against its emperor. Legends say Naram-Sin, desperate to restore his authority, attacked Enlil's temple, desecrating the house of the wind god. That act, more than any war, broke the empire's spirit. The Curse of Agade, one of the most haunting texts from that era, tells what followed. Because he destroyed the city, Enlil unleashed his storm. The people were carried away like leaves before the wind. The fields bore no grain, the rivers carried no fish. For 7 years no seed sprouted in the earth. Famine spread across the land like fire. Whether myth or memory, the result was the same. Akkad fell. The empire that had claimed eternity vanished almost overnight. Its cities were abandoned, its fields buried in dust. Even the capital's location, once the heart of the world, disappeared from memory. To this day, archaeologists search for it in vain, as if the gods themselves erased it from the map. And perhaps that's fitting, for Akkad was never meant to last. It was the human dream of godhood made manifest, and like all such dreams, it collapsed under its own weight. But the story didn't end there. The fall of Akkad was not the end of civilization, it was its transformation. The Akkadians had proven that kingship no longer descended from heaven. It could rise from the earth, forged by will alone. And that idea, that humans could define their own destiny, would echo through every empire that followed. In Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, even into our modern age, that same spirit endures. The flood never ended. It simply changed form. Each generation builds its city upon the ruins of the last, believing that this time the waters will not come. This time our empire will stand. And yet, if you stand in the plains of Mesopotamia today, the wind still carries whispers, the air is thick with dust. Somewhere beneath your feet, the lost bricks of Akkad still lie buried, silent witnesses to the first human empire, the moment we stopped fearing the gods and started becoming them. As night falls over the empty land, one can almost hear the echo of the Akkadian scribes reciting the old words, "Kingship no longer descends from heaven. Kingship is forged by man, and as man rises, so too must he fall." The flood was never just a story of water, it was a cycle, destruction, creation, arrogance, and memory, endlessly repeating through time. In the next part, we'll descend into Babylon, the city that learned to preserve what Sumer and Akkad had forgotten, the city that turned memory itself into immortality, and where the myth of the flood would rise again, retold, reimagined, and written in the language of eternity. When the dust of Akkad finally settled, it was as if the gods themselves had exhaled. The empire that had declared itself immortal was gone, its cities silenced, its rivers choked with silt. For a time there was quiet, a long, uneasy quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath. The flood had come again, not with water, but with emptiness. Yet even in the ashes of empires, memory endures. And in the centuries that followed, a new city began to rise, one built not on conquest, but on remembrance. Its name was Babylon. If Akkad had been a monument to power, Babylon was a monument to time. The Sumerians had invented writing to preserve order. The Akkadians had used it to rule. But the Babylonians, they used it to remember. Their empire was less about armies and more about continuity. They gathered the fragments of every civilization that had come before, Sumerian hymns, Akkadian myths, even the fading whispers of Eridu and Kish, and wove them into something vast and enduring. In the heart of Babylon stood the great Etemenanki, the ziggurat that would one day be remembered as the Tower of Babel. Its name meant the foundation of heaven and earth, and it was exactly that, a staircase between mortals and gods. The Babylonians didn't just rebuild what had been lost. They tried to rewrite the relationship between heaven and man. They knew the old stories well. The Sumerian king list, copied and recopied, still told of kings who reigned before the flood, of Alulim, Al-Algar, and the divine city of Eridu. The flood itself remained the great dividing line in their history, the moment when immortality was taken away and mortality began. But for the Babylonians, the flood was more than a memory. It was the pattern of existence itself. They believed that every age ended the same way, washed clean, reborn through destruction. It was here, among Babylon's libraries and temples, that the legend of the flood was given new life. The story was retold in their language, expanded and reimagined until it became something universal. The version we know best comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the very same king of Uruk, whose name had already become legend. But in Babylon, his story gained its final eternal form. On 12 clay tablets, written in cuneiform by the scholar Sinleki Unini, sometime around 1200 BCE, Gilgamesh's search for immortality was transformed into the definitive tale of human fate. In the 11th tablet, Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, tells his story to the king who seeks eternal life. It is the oldest version of the flood story ever recorded, and yet, when read today, it feels eerily familiar. The gods decided to send a deluge. Their hearts moved them to destroy mankind, but Ea whispered to me in a dream, "Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, and save your life." The words are ancient, but their rhythm is timeless. The flood is not merely punishment, it is purification. The gods regret their creation, then mourn it. The survivor builds his vessel, seals it with pitch, fills it with the seed of every living thing. For 6 days and 7 nights the world drowns. When the waters finally fall, the man releases a dove, then a raven, then steps onto dry land. He offers a sacrifice. The gods, smelling the sweet smoke, remember mercy. It is a story we have told 1,000 times since, in every culture, in every language. But it began here, in Babylon. The flood became more than myth. It became metaphor. For the Babylonians, it explained everything: the fall of Akkad, the rise and ruin of cities, even the cycles of the stars. To them, history was not progress, it was repetition. Each generation built higher towers, reached closer to heaven, and each in turn fell. The flood was the universe's heartbeat, destruction, rebirth, renewal. But Babylon refused to be humbled by the pattern. Instead, they tried to control it. Where Sumer had sought to please the gods, Babylon sought to understand them. They became the astronomers of the ancient world, charting the skies with a precision that still amazes us today. They mapped constellations, predicted eclipses, calculated the paths of Venus and Jupiter. For them, the heavens were not a mystery. They were a code, one that could be deciphered by human reason. In doing so, they turned religion into science. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, became the first scholars. Their ziggurats were observatories, their temples archives of knowledge. And at the center of their belief stood a single audacious idea, that creation itself could be understood. The flood, the stars, the gods, all were part of a grand design, and humanity, through intellect and memory, could learn to read it. That was Babylon's genius, and its flaw, because in their pursuit of knowledge, they began to tread once again upon divine ground. The Enuma Elish, their creation epic, tells of Marduk defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat and fashioning the world from her body. It is the mythic echo of the flood, order rising from destruction. But at the heart of that story lies something dangerous. Marduk, once a lesser god, becomes supreme through strength and wisdom. The other gods yield to him, crown him king of heaven and earth. Babylon had projected its own rise into the heavens. They had made their city divine. Marduk's temple, the Esagila, became the axis of the world, the link between the gods above and below. The king list continued to evolve in this era, expanding to include the dynasties of Babylon, preserving their names alongside those of Sumer and Akkad. The clay didn't just hold memory anymore, it held meaning. The Babylonians saw themselves as the culmination of everything that had come before, the final link in a chain stretching back to the dawn of civilization. And yet, as every age before them had learned, nothing lasts forever. By the 6th century BCE, Babylon had become the jewel of the ancient world. Its hanging gardens, if they truly existed, were said to be a wonder so breathtaking that travelers wept to see them. Its walls stretched for miles, its gates gleamed with blue-glazed tiles bearing the images of lions and dragons. The Ishtar Gate, built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, still stands today, a fragment of a city that once believed it could outlast time. But beneath its splendor the same old flood waited, not of water, not of drought, but of human pride. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon conquered Judah, destroyed Jerusalem's temple, and carried thousands into exile. The captives who came to Babylon brought with them their own stories, their own flood myths, and there, in the libraries of their conquerors, those stories merged. Scholars believe that during this period, the Hebrew scribes who would later compose the book of Genesis encountered the Babylonian flood narrative. They heard the story of Utnapishtim and reshaped it into the story of Noah. The divine punishment, the ark, the dove, the rainbow, echoes of Babylon's ancient memory carried forward into new faiths. In this way, the flood transcended time. It became not just a story of Sumer or Akkad or Babylon, but of all humanity. Each retelling carried the same warning. When men forget their limits, the waters return. Babylon eventually fell, as all empires must. The Persians conquered it in 539 BCE, and later Alexander the Great would die there, in the same city that had crowned itself the navel of the world. The ziggurats crumbled, the libraries turned to dust, but the words remained. Thousands of clay tablets lay buried beneath the desert, waiting for millennia to speak again. And when they were finally unearthed in the 19th century, When modern archaeologists brushed away the sand and found those wedge-shaped lines, humanity heard its oldest story once more: the flood, the kings, the gods, the beginning and the end written in clay. In that moment, the circle closed. The same clay that had recorded the divine kings of Sumer, the fall of Akkad, and the wisdom of Babylon had outlasted them all. The scribes had won. The flood had not erased everything. If the Sumerians gave us memory, and the Akkadians gave us empire, then the Babylonians gave us eternity. Through them, the flood became not an event, but an idea, the eternal cycle of human striving and divine reckoning. And that cycle would continue. For even as Babylon's towers crumbled, its stories sailed across continents and centuries, into Persia, into Greece, into Scripture, into us. In the next part, we'll follow those stories into their new home, across deserts and generations, as the flood becomes myth, faith, and prophecy. We'll see how this ancient memory, born in the mud of Mesopotamia, came to shape the very foundations of human belief. Because the flood never really ended. It simply changed the world forever. When Babylon fell, it did not die. It transformed. The city that had once mapped the heavens and decoded the gods left behind something far greater than its towers or walls. It left behind an inheritance, the written word. And with that word came a story so powerful, so enduring, that it would outlive every empire built after it. The flood that began in Sumer, recorded in Akkad, and immortalized in Babylon, would now take on a new form, one of faith, prophecy, and revelation. The sands of Mesopotamia were still warm from Babylon's collapse when exiled peoples began to gather its fragments. Among them were the Hebrews, carried into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, their own temple in ruins, their faith shaken. In the libraries of Babylon, surrounded by clay tablets etched with the tales of Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh, they found something familiar, a story that echoed their own longing for deliverance. It was there, many scholars believe, that the Sumerian flood was reborn as the story of Noah. In the Babylonian version, the gods send the flood out of frustration. Humanity's noise has become unbearable. In the Hebrew telling, it is not noise but corruption that angers God. Yet the rhythm remains the same: divine warning, construction of a vessel, the saving of the faithful, and the renewal of the world. The ark becomes the bridge between wrath and mercy. The names changed, the language changed, the meaning deepened, but the heartbeat of the story, the pulse of destruction and rebirth, stayed the same. When we open the book of Genesis and read of the deluge, we are hearing the voice of ancient Sumer. Each verse, each wave that sweeps across the earth, carries a whisper from Eridu, from Kish, from the nameless scribes who first pressed their styluses into clay. The flood had ceased to be a historical memory. It had become a spiritual mirror, the story of humanity's eternal struggle to stay worthy of the world. But the story didn't belong to one faith. It began to ripple outward, reshaping itself in every culture it touched. In Persia, the flood became part of Zoroastrian cosmology, retold as the tale of Yima, the righteous man who built an underground refuge to preserve life through an age of ice and darkness. In Greece, the poet Hesiod wrote of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived Zeus's flood by building a chest and later repopulated the earth. In India, the Vedic texts spoke of Manu, warned by a divine fish to build a boat and tie it to a mountain peak. In China, the legend of Gun and Yu told of a deluge so vast that it covered the mountains, tamed only through wisdom and endurance, different lands, different names, but one story: humanity cleansed, tested, reborn. The flood became the archetype of transformation, the moment when the world begins again. For the Sumerians, it was the dividing line between gods and men. For the Hebrews, it was moral reckoning. For the Greeks, it was fate. For the Hindus, it was cosmic renewal. And in every version, one thread binds them together: the idea that knowledge, memory, and virtue must survive the waters, because to forget is to drown. The ark, in all its forms, became the symbol of salvation, not just from divine punishment, but from oblivion itself. Each plank, each nail, each name written into scripture was a continuation of what the Sumerians had begun. When the gods withdrew, humanity built its own vessel, a vessel made of words. By the time the flood story entered the Western world through the Hebrew scriptures, it was already ancient beyond comprehension. The people of the Bronze Age told it by firelight. The scribes of Babylon wrote it in cuneiform. The prophets of Israel turned it into covenant. And from there, it sailed across empires, through the scrolls of Alexandria, the manuscripts of Byzantium, and the sermons of medieval Europe. The story endured not because of its theology, but because of its truth. Every civilization eventually faces its own flood, whether of water, war, or time, and each one, in its own way, must decide what is worth saving. But in the ancient Near East, that decision was more literal than metaphorical. The land was fragile, the rivers unpredictable. Floods still came without warning. When the Euphrates rose, entire villages could vanish overnight. The ancient scribes were not only myth-makers, they were witnesses. Their stories were not allegories written from comfort, they were records written in mud and fear. Imagine standing on those plains 4,000 years ago. The horizon is low and endless, the sky grows dark, the air thick with the scent of rain. The river swells, slow at first, then unstoppable. Cattle are swept away, reeds snap. The cries of children are carried on the wind. To the people who lived through such moments, the flood wasn't just punishment. It was the face of the divine. And yet every time the waters fell, they built again. This is the true legacy of the flood, not destruction, but resilience. Humanity's refusal to surrender. The belief that what matters most can be preserved. The ark, whether wooden or metaphorical, is our collective act of defiance against oblivion. As centuries turned to millennia, the flood's shape continued to evolve. In Christian tradition, it became a story of sin and redemption. In Islam, the Quran retold it in the story of Nuh, whose ark came to rest upon Mount Judi, not Ararat. In each faith, the message shifted slightly, but the warning remained. Pride brings the waters, faith builds the vessel. But there's something else, something deeper. Beneath the morality and myth lies a shared human memory, perhaps even a shared trauma. Geologists and archaeologists have long debated whether a real event inspired these tales, a flood so catastrophic it seared itself into human consciousness. Evidence of massive flooding around the Black Sea and the Mesopotamian plains around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago supports this possibility. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by melting glaciers, could have burst their banks and consumed vast stretches of land. To early humans, such an event would have felt like the end of the world. And maybe it was, at least the world as they knew it. That memory passed from generation to generation, evolving as language evolved, adapting to new gods, new kings, new empires. Yet through all its transformations, the core remained. The flood comes when we forget who we are. Every civilization that followed carried that lesson in its bones. When kingdoms fell, when cities burned, the survivors reached for the same metaphor. The flood has come again. Whether it was the fall of Akkad, the exile of Babylon, or the collapse of Rome, humanity always framed its disasters in the language of water, because the flood is not just about drowning, it's about cleansing. It wipes away the noise, the corruption, the pride, leaving behind what is essential. It forces renewal. The Sumerians knew it, the Babylonians refined it, the prophets sanctified it, And we even now repeat it. Look around our modern world, our cities, our technologies, our towers of glass and steel. Each is another Etemenanki, another ziggurat built in defiance of heaven. We call it progress. The ancients would have called it hubris. And deep down, we still fear the flood, not of rain, but of collapse, of the sudden silence that follows when our towers fall. That fear is the echo of our oldest memory. The flood still flows through our stories, our religions, our very psychology. It reminds us that everything built too high, too proud, too detached from the earth must one day face the water. But it also tells us that from every destruction, something new can be born, if we remember. In that sense, the true ark is not the boat or the mountain or even the story itself. It is memory, the ability to carry knowledge across the flood, to preserve what makes us human when everything else is washed away. The Sumerians were the first to write that ark. The Babylonians perfected it. The Hebrews carried it forward. And we, every historian, every storyteller, every listener, are still building it, word by word. In the next part, we'll follow the flood's final transformation, from story into symbol, from myth into cosmic truth. We'll journey into the ancient mystery schools where the flood became initiation and where its meaning shifted from history to eternity. Because for the ancients, the waters did not only destroy the world, they also awakened the soul. The flood, they believed, was never just about the end. It was about remembering how to begin. Every great civilization has a story of water, not simply as destruction, but as transformation. To the Sumerians, the flood was history. To the Babylonians, it was memory. But as the centuries turned and empires gave way to religions, that same flood began to mean something deeper. The waters that once drowned the world became a symbol of renewal, cleansing, and rebirth. The flood was no longer just an ending. It became initiation. Long after the cities of Mesopotamia had turned to dust, their stories continued to ripple outward. The flood's meaning, once literal, began to evolve into metaphor, a language of spirit rather than soil. Across temples, mystery schools, and sacred texts, the idea took hold that to cross the waters was to awaken. Death and rebirth, darkness and light, forgetting and remembering. The earliest known mystery initiations in Egypt, Greece, and even later in early Christianity all carried echoes of this ancient pattern. The flood was not only an event that once happened, it was a process that every soul must endure. In the temples of ancient Egypt, initiates underwent rituals that reenacted the journey through the underworld, the passage through chaos before the dawn of enlightenment. They descended into chambers filled with water, symbolic of the primeval flood, the Nun, the endless sea that existed before creation. There in darkness, the initiate died to the world of illusion. When he emerged, purified and reborn, he was said to have crossed the waters of the gods. That moment, immersion, death and return, is one of the oldest spiritual metaphors in human history. It would reappear thousands of years later in Christian baptism, in Hindu ablution, in Buddhist symbolism of the lotus rising from mud. Each tradition tells the same story in a different tongue. The waters take everything from you, and in that taking, you are made new. This idea did not begin with religion, it began with memory. The ancient Mesopotamians understood that water was both giver and taker. It fed their crops, filled their canals, and birthed their cities, but it could also erase them in a single night. To live on that land was to live on the edge of annihilation. Their entire world view was built on that tension. The flood was not merely divine wrath, it was divine rhythm, the destruction that makes space for creation. The scribes of Sumer had already encoded this in their myths. The god Enki, lord of the deep, was both savior and destroyer, the one who unleashed the waters and the one who saved humanity from them. His domain, the Abzu, was not hell or heaven, but the realm of potential, the source of all life. To descend into it was to touch the origins of existence. To rise from it was to return with wisdom. By the time of Babylon, this duality had become philosophy. The flood represented the eternal cycle, chaos followed by order, ignorance followed by enlightenment. Marduk's slaying of Tiamat, the goddess of the primordial sea, was not just a cosmic battle. It was the triumph of consciousness over chaos. Every initiation, every purification, every ritual washing was a reenactment of that act, the symbolic flood that cleanses the soul and reveals the light. Centuries later, the Greeks inherited this idea, translating it into their own language of myth. Plato wrote of Atlantis, a civilization so advanced and proud that it angered the gods and was swallowed by the sea. But in that destruction, he hinted at rebirth, a cleansing of the world's moral decay. The philosopher saw the flood not as punishment, but as correction, the necessary reset that returns balance to creation. In the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, initiates were symbolically drowned in ritual darkness before being shown a blinding light, the revelation that life and death were one continuous stream. Happy is he who, having seen these mysteries, descends below, said the poet Pindar, for he knows the end of life and its divine beginning. That is the same message carried by the flood, that to survive it, one must let go of the old self. The Hebrews too would carry that symbolism into their faith. When Noah's flood recedes, a new covenant is born, a rainbow stretched across the heavens like a bridge between mortal and divine. Later, the prophets would echo the same metaphor. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. To pass through the water was to be forgiven, renewed. Even the act of crossing rivers, the Jordan, the Nile, the Ganges, became sacred. Water separated worlds, the profane from the divine, the living from the dead, the ignorant from the wise. To step into it was to die. To emerge was to begin again. And yet, beneath all this symbolism lies something profoundly human, the recognition that every transformation demands loss. The flood strips everything away. It drowns not only the wicked, but the proud, the comfortable, the unprepared. It leaves only those willing to start over. That is why every ancient initiation, from Egypt to Eleusis, began with ordeal. The initiate was humbled, tested, broken down, before being granted new sight. The waters were never meant to destroy, they were meant to unmake, because only in unmaking can one be remade. In the ruins of Babylon's libraries, archaeologists have found clay tablets describing ritual cleansings and purifications that predate every organized religion we know. On one tablet, written in Akkadian, the priest describes the act of bathing before entering the temple. He purifies himself in the waters of the Abzu. The sins of the flesh fall away like clay. Even then, water had ceased to be merely physical. It had become moral, spiritual, cosmic. To the ancient mind, all creation was water, and all return would be water. This truth extended even into the afterlife. In the Mesopotamian descent of Inanna, the goddess passes through 7 gates, stripped of everything she possesses, until she reaches the dark underworld. Only by enduring death, by surrendering all, can she rise again. It is another flood story, told through a goddess rather than a king. Her descent is the flood, her ascent is the dawn. Every time the ancients retold these stories, Inanna, Utnapishtim, Noah, Deucalion, they weren't just preserving myth. They were preserving a lesson, that destruction is not an end, but a passage. As the old temples fell and new faiths rose, this wisdom endured in subtler forms. In early Christianity, baptism was not merely a ritual of belonging. It was death and resurrection. To be immersed in water was to descend into the flood that had once consumed the world. To rise again was to stand in a new creation. The same current flowed through Gnostic teachings, which spoke of the soul's journey through chaos back to the source, through water, through unknowing, through rebirth. In India, the same motif found new life in the story of Manu and Matsya, the divine fish who guides humanity through the flood. The fish becomes the teacher, the ark becomes wisdom, and the flood becomes ignorance washed away by truth. In this way, the ancient Mesopotamian flood was reborn yet again, transformed into spiritual philosophy. Even in modern times, the language of the flood remains woven into us. When we speak of washing away the past, cleansing the soul, or baptism by fire and water, we are echoing Sumerian prayers thousands of years old. The flood never left us, because it represents something universal, the breaking and remaking that defines existence itself. What the ancients understood, and what we often forget, is that every flood, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is both end and beginning. The waters rise when we grow too proud, too distant from the natural order. They strip us of what we have built, but when they fall, the world gleams again, raw and pure. The flood is a teacher, a cruel one, but a necessary one. From Sumer to Babylon, from Egypt to Jerusalem, from the Ganges to the Jordan, it whispered the same truth. There is no creation without chaos, no enlightenment without surrender. And those who pass through the waters, whether in ritual or ruin, emerge not the same as before. That is the flood's greatest secret. It is not about punishment. It is about potential. Every civilization that survived it carried its wisdom forward, building temples, writing scriptures, teaching generations to remember. The water took their cities, their empires, their kings, but it could not take the story, because the story is the ark. In the next part, we'll travel deeper into that idea, into how later mystics, philosophers, and prophets interpreted the flood not as an ancient memory, but as a cosmic truth, the rhythm of the universe itself. From Mesopotamia's rivers to the stars above, they began to see that the flood was not only history, it was the heartbeat of creation. Because once you understand the flood, you understand the pattern of everything that has ever been born, and everything that must one day return. Long before telescopes measured the heavens or scientists named the stars, the ancients had already sensed a pattern written in both the sky and the soul. It was the rhythm that governed not only the rivers of Mesopotamia, but the rise and fall of all creation, a vast breathing of the cosmos itself. To them, the flood was not merely an event or even a memory. It was a reflection of that rhythm, a cycle of destruction and renewal that pulsed through the universe like a heartbeat. The Sumerians called it Me, the divine order, a system by which all things were given their shape, their function, their purpose. It was the architecture of reality, the pattern that kept chaos at bay. But they also knew that even Me could fail. When the flood came, it was not random. It was the cosmos resetting its balance. To the ancients, this rhythm was divine justice, the universe cleansing itself so that creation could begin anew. Over centuries, as their understanding of the heavens deepened, they began to see that this cosmic rhythm was mirrored in the movement of the stars. The flood, they realized, was not just something that happened on earth, it was reflected in the sky. The priests of Ur, Uruk, and Babylon were not only storytellers, they were astronomers. They noticed that the heavens moved in cycles, the return of Venus, the slow drift of the constellations, the turning of the equinox. To them, these were not coincidences, they were divine patterns, cosmic floods washing across time. Every celestial movement had its reflection below. The stars rose and kingdoms rose. The stars fell and empires drowned. The rhythm of heaven was the rhythm of history. This belief was not superstition. It was an early attempt to describe the deep, recurring pulse of time. In Babylon, the astronomer priests of Marduk developed one of the first mathematical calendars. They divided time into ages, each ruled by a zodiacal sign, each an echo of creation's cycles. They saw eras of light and eras of darkness, each ending with a great cleansing, a flood of fire or water. To them, the world did not march forward toward progress. It turned in circles, vast, repeating, inevitable. The flood was the reset between these ages. Later philosophers would call this the Great Year, a cosmic cycle of creation, corruption, and renewal. The Stoics believed that at the end of each age, the universe itself was consumed by fire, only to be reborn exactly as before. The Hindus would call it the Yuga cycle, where the world passes through golden, silver, bronze, and dark ages before being destroyed and remade. But these later ideas were all seeded by the same Mesopotamian insight. That time itself was fluid, tidal, and alive. Every flood was not just punishment, but pulse, a heartbeat of the cosmos. The ancients didn't have the language of physics or astronomy, but they had intuition. They understood that everything, from the orbit of planets to the seasons of the earth to the fortunes of kings, moved in waves. The flood was their way of describing entropy and renewal, the oscillation between order and chaos. When we look at the king list again through this lens, it becomes something much more than a historical record. It is a cosmic diagram. The divine kings of the pre-flood world, reigning for tens of thousands of years, represent a golden age, a time when heaven and earth were one. The flood then divides the ages, a symbolic 0 point, the collapse before rebirth. The mortal kings that follow are not just rulers. They are timekeepers, marking the slow return toward another inevitable flood. The Sumerians may not have known the laws of thermodynamics, but they grasped the truth that everything decays, and that decay is not the end. It is the beginning of a new order. In their temples, priests would chant hymns to the gods of water, Enki, Ea, Namu, not as destroyers, but as maintainers of this balance. The flood was feared, yes, but it was also sacred. Without it, the world would stagnate. The flood renewed the covenant between man and the divine. It reminded humanity of its place in the cycle, neither above nor below, but within. By the time Babylon rose, this cosmic understanding had become almost scientific. The Babylonians built vast observatories atop their ziggurats, where they tracked the motions of the planets for centuries. They noticed that the heavens themselves seemed to move backward, a slow procession of the equinoxes that unfolded over thousands of years. This motion, now known to modern science as the precession of Earth's axis, created the appearance of a cosmic flood, the slow drift of the constellations through the ages. To the priests, this was not coincidence. It was the breath of the gods. The same flood that once drowned the world now flowed through the stars. Each age, marked by a new constellation rising at dawn, was a new chapter in the divine cycle. It's no coincidence that so many ancient cultures believed in ages of the world. The Greeks spoke of the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, each one descending into corruption before being washed away. The Persians called it the Frashokereti, a world periodically purified and remade. Even the Mayans, half a world away, spoke of previous suns, entire worlds destroyed by flood, fire, or darkness before the dawn of the present one. The pattern is everywhere. Humanity, it seems, never forgot the flood. In the temples of Nippur, scribes wrote of cosmic order as if it were a living thing, a system of currents and tides flowing through all realms. They described the universe as a great ocean, with stars as islands of light and gods as its navigators. The flood, in this vision, was not an interruption of order, but a restoration of it, the ocean reclaiming what had gone astray. And here lies the deeper truth of the Sumerian worldview. The flood was not a failure of the gods nor of man. It was a reset, an act of mercy disguised as destruction. It was the moment when the divine remembered itself through chaos. In later mystical traditions, Gnostic, Hermetic, even Kabbalistic, this same idea would reappear. The cosmos was a living organism, constantly inhaling and exhaling, expanding and contracting, forgetting and remembering. The flood became the breath of that organism, the moment when all things dissolve into unity before re-emerging as multiplicity. In this light, the flood was not history, but heartbeat. Every empire that rose on the Mesopotamian plain carried that understanding, whether they knew it or not. The Sumerians had lived through their flood. The Akkadians created theirs through arrogance. The Babylonians remembered theirs through myth. And each believed deep down that another would come. Because the flood is not a single event, it is time itself. When we look up at the night sky, at the slow wheel of stars, we are watching the same rhythm that the priests of Babylon once measured with clay and reed. The universe is still breathing. Galaxies are born, burn bright, and are swept away. Worlds collide, suns drown in their own gravity. The flood, it seems, never ended, it simply grew larger. And if the cosmos itself moves in cycles of creation and destruction, then perhaps so too does humanity. Our wars, our rises and falls, our revolutions, all are waves in the same eternal sea. The Sumerians intuited this truth in their clay, the Babylonians wrote it in their stars, and we, thousands of years later, continue to live within its tide. The flood, then, is not the wrath of gods, but the rhythm of the universe, the endless, necessary renewal that ensures nothing ever truly dies, only changes form. In the next part, we will descend from the stars back to the earth, to the archaeologists and historians who unearthed the first physical evidence of the flood. We will see how myth and science converge, how ancient memory meets geological truth. Because somewhere beneath the dust of Mesopotamia, the line between story and history blurs. And the flood, it seems, may not be a myth after all. The clay still remembers, and it waits for us to listen. For millennia, the flood existed only as a story, carved in clay, whispered by priests, sung by poets, and finally sanctified by scripture. It was myth, history, and theology all at once. But then, one day in the modern age, the earth itself began to speak. Beneath the plains of Mesopotamia, the soil told its own version of the story, one not written by kings or gods, but by time. The first hint came in the 1920s, when a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley began to dig at a site near modern Tel el-Mukayyar, the ruins of Ur, the ancient city of Abraham and of the Sumerian kings. Woolley was searching for evidence of the earliest civilizations, but what he found instead was something far older, far stranger. At a depth of nearly 40 feet, his team uncovered a thick layer of clay, sterile, smooth, and utterly devoid of human life. No tools, no pottery, no bones, just silt. Beneath it, deeper still, they found another layer. Older pottery, older houses, the remnants of a civilization long gone. The meaning was unmistakable. Between two human worlds lay a desert of mud, over 10 feet thick, laid down in a single event. Woolley ran his fingers through the clay and whispered, "This must be the flood." He wasn't the first to think of it. For centuries, scholars had wondered whether the deluge of Genesis and the flood of Utnapishtim might point to a real catastrophe. But Woolley's discovery was the first tangible proof. Geological evidence of a vast flood that wiped clean an entire region, only for civilization to rise again on top of it. The clay layer at Ur was not isolated. Similar strata were later found at Shuruppak and Kish, both ancient cities named in the king list as pre- and post-flood centers of kingship. The flood layer matched across sites, a blanket of fine river silt deposited by massive inundation. It was not a myth. It was sediment. Radiocarbon dating placed the event around 2900 BCE, precisely the period the Sumerian king list places between the kings before the flood and the kings after. History and geology, once strangers, now spoke the same language. The flood had happened. The only question was how. Modern scientists believe it was likely caused by the violent flooding of the Euphrates and Tigris, perhaps following heavy rains or the breaking of natural levees. The rivers, swollen and enraged, could have drowned entire cities overnight. To the survivors, the destruction would have felt total, global. Every direction they turned would have been water. Every memory erased. For people who lived their lives bound to the river, that event would have been divine. When the waters finally receded and the survivors rebuilt, they must have carried with them the same awe, the same terror that the ancient texts describe. Over generations, the story grew. The local flood became the flood of the world. The survivors became the chosen few. And as the centuries passed, the memory solidified into scripture. Woolley's discovery, while revolutionary, did not end the debate. It deepened it. Other archaeologists pointed out that flooding was common in Mesopotamia. There were many floods, some small, some catastrophic, and each city might have preserved its own version. The king list, then, could have merged multiple disasters into one cosmic event. But the timing was too perfect to ignore. The transition from pre-flood to post-flood dynasties in Sumer coincides exactly with this layer of destruction, a moment when the ancient world truly began anew. To the people who lived through it, it would have felt like the world's rebirth. Yet as archaeologists dug deeper, they began to realize something even more profound. The flood was not the only layer of destruction. Beneath it lay still older cities, forgotten civilizations that had risen and fallen before Sumer itself. The deeper they dug, the older the story became. At Eridu, the oldest of all Sumerian cities, excavations revealed 17 distinct levels of occupation, each built atop the ruins of the one before. The lowest layers, dating back over 7,000 years, held the remains of reed huts built along ancient shorelines, the world's first temples. And even there, deep in prehistory, were signs of flooding. It seemed the flood had always been with them, not as a single moment, but as a pattern, an ever-returning force shaping the land and the people who called it home. This realization changed everything. The flood, the scholars realized, was not a single story but a memory of many. Every generation had faced its own deluge, every culture its own erasure. The Sumerians, with their clay tablets and obsessive record-keeping, had simply been the first to write it down. But perhaps the most striking discovery came in the late 20th century, far from Mesopotamia, in the Black Sea. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, suggesting that around 5600 BCE, melting glaciers caused the Mediterranean to burst through the Bosporus Strait, flooding a massive freshwater lake and creating the Black Sea as we know it. The waters, they estimated, rose more than 150 meters in a matter of months, drowning villages, farmlands, and entire cultures. To those who lived there, it would have seemed as though the sea itself had exploded. And when the survivors fled southward, some may have carried their story with them, down into Anatolia, into Mesopotamia, into the heart of Sumer. Over generations, the details blurred, but the core memory, the flood that destroyed the world, endured. It's a haunting thought that the story written in cuneiform, the story retold in Genesis, may have begun with a real deluge, remembered by people whose names and languages have vanished entirely. Yet the more we uncover, the more it seems that the ancients knew exactly what they were describing. The Sumerian king list divides time into two distinct epochs: before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven, and after, when it returned to earth. Modern archaeology tells the same story in another language. Before the flood, Neolithic settlements clustered along riverbanks, living in relative harmony. After the flood, cities appeared: walls, temples, writing. Civilization as we know it began only after disaster. Perhaps the flood didn't destroy the world, perhaps it created it. In this light, the flood becomes not merely an event, but the threshold between worlds, the dividing line between memory and history, myth and record, dream and document. Before it, the gods ruled. After it, men did. Every trowel of earth turned in those ancient cities revealed the same truth the Sumerians had written down 5,000 years ago. Civilization is born from catastrophe. The flood is both an ending and a beginning. Woolley once said, "In that clay I felt the breath of history itself." And he was right. Because that same clay, the mud that buried cities and lives, is what preserved their words. The waters erased, but the earth remembered. Even today, when archaeologists brush dust from a tablet, they are reenacting the same gesture as those first survivors, bringing memory back from the flood. The evidence of the flood is everywhere. In the soil, in the myths, in the stars, and perhaps even in us. We carry it in our collective memory, our instinctive fear of rising waters, our fascination with the end of the world. The flood is not just a chapter in history. It is a code in the human mind, and maybe that's why we keep finding it, over and over, wherever we dig. In the next and final part, we'll return to where it all began, to the Sumerian king list itself. We'll ask what it truly meant, why it was written, and whether the flood it describes was only the past, or also a warning for the future. Because perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not whether the flood happened, but whether it will happen again. Somewhere in the silent vaults of a museum, behind glass and shadow, lies a small piece of clay. Its surface is cracked, its edges worn by time, but the marks pressed into it still speak. It is one of the fragments of the Sumerian king list, a document written more than 4,000 years ago, when kings were gods and the sky was still a language. The words on that tablet are simple. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven once more. That single line carries the weight of everything humanity remembers and everything it fears. It is both a statement of survival and a prophecy of return. Because the flood, that endless rhythm of destruction and renewal, has never truly gone. It waits, patient and inevitable, beneath the surface of history. The Sumerians knew it, the Babylonians remembered it, the Hebrews preserved it, the Greeks philosophized about it, and today, though we speak of ice caps and rising seas instead of Enki and Enlil, we still whisper the same truth. The waters are always coming back. But what the ancients left us is not only a warning, it is also a guide. The king list was more than a chronicle. It was a message in code, an instruction manual for survival. Every name, every reign, every impossible number was meant to preserve not just memory, but understanding. The list was a bridge between eras, between the divine world that drowned and the human one that rose in its place. To the Sumerians, time was not linear, it was circular, tidal. The flood was not once upon a time, but it was inevitable. Every cycle, they believed, must return to its beginning, the sea. The king list marks that return, not with despair, but with awe. The flood erases, yes, but it also renews. It clears the board so that life can begin again. It's worth asking why the scribes recorded the pre-flood kings at all. They could have begun with Gilgamesh, or with Uruk, or with the first kings of history. But they didn't. They reached backward into the impossible, to reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, to cities ruled by beings said to walk with gods. Why? Because they weren't writing history. They were writing memory. The pre-flood kings were archetypes, symbols of a lost perfection. Their impossible reigns represented the golden age before corruption, before mortality, before the divine withdrew. The flood was the dividing line, the moment when eternity broke and time began. What we call civilization was, to them, merely the aftermath of the deluge. In that sense, the king list is not about kings at all. It is about the human condition. It's about what happens when the divine departs and humanity must take its place, when kingship descends from heaven into human hands. It's the story of every empire, every rebirth, every time we rebuild from the ruins thinking we will last forever. The flood is the reminder that we won't. When archaeologists like Leonard Woolley brushed the mud from those tablets, they weren't just uncovering history. They were resurrecting a mirror. And what they found reflected not only Sumer's fate, but our own. Every civilization builds its towers, its walls, its gods, believing the waters will never come again. But they always do. In the story of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, the god Ea warns him in a dream. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. The command is both literal and eternal. It is the same whisper that echoes through every age. Let go of what cannot last. When the flood comes, only those who remember how to float will survive. Perhaps that is why these myths endure. They are not only explanations of the past, they are rehearsals for the future. We like to think we've escaped the ancient cycle. We've traded gods for equations, temples for towers, myths for machines. But if the flood was ever more than water, if it was a metaphor for collapse, for renewal, then it still moves through us. The rivers rise, the markets crash, empires crumble, and from the mud, new ones grow. The pattern never ends. Modern science calls it catastrophism, the idea that the Earth's story is punctuated by sudden world-changing events, floods, impacts, extinctions. The ancients called it judgment. But in both views, the rhythm is the same. Periods of calm, then upheaval, creation, then dissolution. And so the Sumerian king list becomes more than a relic. It becomes a cosmic pulse rendered in clay. The kings who reigned before the flood ruled in mythic time, vast cyclical ages of light. The flood then resets the clock and history begins. Each age after grows shorter, faster, more fragile. The pattern compresses, the tempo increases, until one day perhaps it will break again. When we read those ancient lines, we are not reading about them. We are reading about us. Because the flood is not finished. It is in the melting ice of the north, in the rising seas that gnaw at our shores, in the silent storms gathering on horizons both physical and moral. The ancients believed that when humanity forgot its place in the cosmic order, when arrogance replaced harmony, the flood would return, not as punishment, but as correction. And perhaps beneath all our noise we know they were right. If you look at a map of the world today, the deltas, the river plains, the coastlines where billions now live, you are looking at the same stage where the first flood played out. Civilization still builds where the waters once swallowed kings. We have built our towers again, our uruks and our eridus reaching for the heavens just as they did, and the rivers still rise. The king list stands as a whisper through time. Remember that what rises must fall, that what drowns will one day rise again, that every flood, physical or spiritual, is both an ending and an invitation to begin anew. When the scribes of Sumer etched those words into clay, they were performing an act of defiance. Clay, after all, was what the flood left behind. They took the very substance of destruction and turned it into memory. They made the flood speak. Thousands of years later, we are still listening. And so this story, the true story of the Sumerian king list, is not one of kings and gods alone. It is a story of us, of how we endure, how we remember, and how, despite every deluge, we keep writing. Each civilization leaves its mark on the clay, and each one is eventually washed away. But the act of writing, of remembering, is what keeps the flame alive. That is what the Sumerians understood. That is why they wrote. And perhaps, as the tides of our own world begin to shift again, it is time we remember their lesson. The flood is not the end. It is the beginning of everything that will ever come after. Before we close, if you've made it this far, thank you for being part of this journey through time. If you'd like to help us keep exploring these lost worlds, take a moment to subscribe and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Together, we're keeping these ancient voices alive, one story at a time. Because the flood may return, but as long as we remember, the light will rise again.